Rolake Arts and Book Festival 2021 online. My name is Kobie Biakolo, and I welcome you to my panel discussion with Otega Uwagba, Rolake Akigbe Filani, and Osaratin Victor Asemota. So we're going to get right into it. Please do give just a tiny bit of an introduction about yourself. To get started right away, one of the through lines through Let's Talk About Money by you, Otega, was this idea that our early childhood experiences shape our ideas on money. For those whose childhood experiences create arguably unhealthy relationships with money on one end of the spectrum, or on the other end of the spectrum, saving to the point of hoarding, which I really enjoyed in your book, is there a meaningful remedy that can permanently result in a shift in perspective?
Hi everyone, my name is Otega Uwagba and I've recently published a book called We Need to Talk About Money, which is a part memoir about my own experiences with money and part cultural commentary, which is about, what those experiences say about the wider world in general as it relates to class, poverty, wealth, inequality, feminism, race, beauty, you name it, I'm covering it. But in answer to that question, something that I write about in my book is about how, having moved to the UK at the age of 5, as many Nigerians do, as many immigrants do, my family didn't have a lot of money, and watching certain struggles, as I grew up, I was one of 3 sisters, that really left a lasting imprint on me. And in my case, it led to actually really good financial practice. One thing I'm really glad for is that I'm very financially literate. I've always been quite sensible with money. Something I talk about in the book, and which you just alluded to, is the fact that I've always been a saver, almost to the point where it became a bit unhealthy. But beneath all of that, I had a real anxiety about money, which I think in many ways and on many occasions kind of really stopped me from enjoying life. And there was an anxiety that was probably not necessary. And to be honest, I only really started to examine that when I started writing this book. So I first started thinking about writing it about 3 years ago. And in, exploring money in general, I obviously had to look at my own money story and figure out where my own mindset had come from. And, different people are going to have different relationships. It might be that your parents, you grew up with your parents spoiling you and, throwing money at the problem. And now as an adult, that's the way in which you choose to show affection to others, which at the best makes you a very generous person. At the worst, it might make you somebody who's very easily kind of taken advantage of by others. And because I'm a writer, I tend to, the way I think things through is to write things down. And I really kind of wrote down what are the words that I associate with money. And, for me, one of mine was security. Another one was freedom. But I really just kind of did this kind of free association exercise when I was starting to write the book. And I think a lot of it is what has been beneficial for me in terms of researching the book and writing it is it's enabled me to have really honest conversations with people. Now, obviously, that is kind of the thrust of my book. We Need to Talk About Money. I think it's doing that and kind of shedding that shame has actually been really transformative for my relationship with money and how I feel about money. I'm not promising, the premise of the book isn't that, just merely talking about money will change your material financial position. But for me, it allowed me to uncover why I felt certain anxieties and vulnerabilities and jealousies and pride and shame, all these things, some very negative emotions that I think a lot of people feel around money. And just having conversations with the people in my life, with my parents, with my friends, with my sisters, was really important for me in getting to a better, healthier place. I think for some people that fix might be therapy. There are therapists who specialize in financial therapy. That's not something that I felt like I needed because I was afforded so much introspection by virtue of writing this book. But the thing about shame when it comes to money is that it really thrives in secrecy and it thrives in the darkness. And so the best solution that I've found is to talk about it more openly with the people in your life.
Rolake, what about yourself? What are your early childhood experiences and how do they form your relationship with money? And do you think for adults who are on one side of the spectrum or the other, there is a meaningful remedy that can result in a shift in perspective in their relationship to money?
Thanks for that question. So my name is Rolake Akinkugbe Filani, and I work as a senior corporate executive. I've had probably about 15 years of career experience. And in answer to that question, I go back to one particular evening in Lagos when I was growing up in my very early teen years. I was probably about 12 or 13. And I'm sure she wouldn't mind me sharing this. I remember hearing my mom sobbing in the living room. And I thought, well, that's really strange. What could be making my mom, who I'd never really seen, cry? And she had just had a really, really terrible experience in relation to her finances with somebody else. And she felt totally drained, used, misused. And I remember she said to me that, and I'm trying to quote verbatim, she said something like, Rolake, whatever you do in life, whoever you're with, just remember that your financial independence is absolutely key as a woman. And till today, I never forget that particular piece of advice. It sort of guided my perspective. But it's a double-edged sword. And why I say that, because there's an overconsciousness and an overinterpretation that then comes in handling money when you've got advice like that at such a young age. Because I somehow associated my ability to find that financial independence with progressing life. And so anything that sort of threatens that or attempts to threaten that, I then see it as a very strong negative. So I think I went through a point in my life where I did struggle to manage my emotions around money and finances because, any sign of financial gaps or lack of funding or finances then gave me a lot of emotional anxiety. So, in as much as it was fantastic advice and I've evolved and moved on in life, but I think it was one of those things that very early on shaped my relationship with money. I think the other really interesting part of it is, I grew up in a family where my parents made huge sacrifices to send pretty much all their children overseas for education. And so that element of needing to shore up for the next generation and the concept of creating generational wealth is something that rings constantly in my mind and in how I plan my life. So this concept of sustainability as somebody who either saves, invests, or spends, and all that goes into planning for that sustainability is something that I've more recently become obsessed with. And I think in the broader context, people define sustainability as spending and consuming today without jeopardizing the needs of future generations. So when you bring that to a very personal level, it's really about me thinking about my children and their children. Am I creating a legacy? And I think that's a really, really important part of the money conversation. And then the final point really was more around women, and something that I really, really actively support and champion is women and financial empowerment. I'm sure many have been following the Smart Money Woman series now going on Netflix. And at the various points throughout watching that series, I felt really emotional because it sort of charts the lives of 5 or 6 young millennials who are facing challenges that are life altering. And it's all centered around money or the lack of. And it just goes to show the centrality of wealth or money and whatever sort of moral compass we all have around that in all our lives, whether we want to admit it or not, both for those who have and for those who have not, and for those who are on the journey to seeking it and using it in the best way possible.
Thank you for that. Asarafin, what about yourself? What is your early childhood memory of money? And I also really want to emphasize this point of, are we at the mercy of our childhood?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. My name is Asarafin Victor Samota. I have been a tech entrepreneur for many years. I started at a very early age. Started as my first company when I was 22. Retired actively from there in 2018, but for the past 10 or 11 years, I've been actively investing in a lot of companies. And I'm also right now a partner in a couple of venture capital funds. For me, the way we were brought up, we didn't really have to worry about money because we had this very, very communal form of existence. My father lived in his father's house even after he was married. I had all of us there. My maternal grandmother was actually very, very wealthy before she passed. Maternal grandfather too was a very, very wealthy landowner. But my mother had to look after all her siblings after her father passed. So that was where I first started seeing some tensions with money. But for me, it was when I was 11 when my mom had to go abroad, go to school in the UK, when I had to now live with her uncle, who was a reverend gentleman, who didn't really have much to provide for a very, very large family with about 17 people living in his household. That it was then I actually now understood what you had to do to make ends meet when money wasn't really there. So we were forced to be self-sufficient. We had to make things to sell, to contribute to the household. At 11, that was the first time I had to go to the market to sell things. I wasn't forced, but it was a very, very good experience, for me, because all of the things that I do today came from that experience I had when I was 11 years old. Thank you.
My next question, I want to get a bit away from childhood. And, I'll begin with you, Rolake. What has been the single most transformative experience in your adulthood in how you frame wealth and success, and in how you wish to define it in the society that you live in?
I think, I guess if I'm going to sort of help people understand this, then I have to really be an open book on this conversation. And so I will say I was once a divorcee. So I got married quite young. I think I was 23. Well, for me, it was young, especially for somebody who was quite career focused. This was when I was living in the UK. That marriage lasted about 4.5 years. And I think one of the things I quickly realized, because I had sort of built my entire existence around this man who was essentially my first love, my first everything. I'd sort of gone into marriage as this bright-eyed, energetic, enthusiastic woman who was going to balance marriage and motherhood and career, have a high-flying career, traveling around the world and jet-setting. And I never really failed at anything in life. That's the reality. But I failed, at least what I thought was failure in the area of my relationship, because it ended in a divorce. And I remember how emotionally broken I was, because he actually filed for divorce. And I always tell people there's a psychology that comes with being the petitioner versus the person who has to respond to the divorce. But to cut a long story short, one of the things that quickly occurred to me after that particular episode in my life was I had literally built my psychological, mental, emotional existence around him. And thankfully, because of the advice and sort of the anxiety I had carried, I had this deep anxiety about being left stranded with nothing in life from childhood. That story I told you. I think going into marriage, in some weird way, it was easier for me to pick up the broken pieces of my life. And it was actually a really devastating experience, because I often tell people that being married, where you're so intertwined with someone and then you divorce, is almost just as, and I don't mean to belittle the experiences of those who have been through grief of a spouse, but it almost felt like a part of you is broken. But one of the things that really kept me going in a weird sort of way was the fact that I could still fend for myself. And I wasn't the sort of stereotypical story of the African woman who had lost everything, her possessions, her livelihood, her house, because she'd gone through a relationship severance. And so for me, it was quite a transformational experience. It further reinforced, I think in some ways, it reinforced my emotional anxiety around money. But, through the years, I've sort of developed a much more healthy relationship with money. And whilst it doesn't consume everything I do, there's always that sense of, I need to have stability and independence. And so for me, that was a major turning point. So even in mentoring other young women now, whether it's career, relationship, business, that is an undercurrent that sort of drives my advice and my counseling without scaremongering, obviously. I don't know if that counts, but that's my reality and that's my story. And that's the one obvious thing that I can really, really think of with regards to that question.
Thank you.
So I think for me, if I think about, the events in my life that have been most transformative for my relationship with money, I can think of two. So one is, I think early on in my life, when I was 11 or when I was 10 or 11, I won a full academic scholarship to really elite private school here in London. And it's not something that my parents would have been able to afford, but it just so happens that, I managed to get this scholarship. And especially within the UK, only 7% of school children within the UK are privately educated. And at the time, my parents were so ecstatic. They were so pleased. Obviously, how Nigerians are. Education is really at the forefront. And I think they understood the extent to which that, privilege was going to transform my life. But for me personally, I didn't have that understanding at the time. It was only until I've gotten later into life, as I, entered the world of work, entered the workplace, and saw the extent to which class and privilege and private education really plays a role in your professional and personal trajectory here in the UK, which might be to a greater or lesser extent in different countries and different places in Africa and Nigeria. But in the UK, it really, really is so stratified. I think without realizing, that was where kind of my life really took a turn, and that was a fork in the road. And it was also interesting because it really exposed me to, how the other half live. And so I feel like I gained an understanding of, by virtue of going to this private school and then going on to Oxford, I really got a very 360 understanding of people's attitudes to money when they come from a lot of it, which is a lot of the people that, I was spending my time around. And when also you don't necessarily come from a lot of it, which was my situation. So I think the other thing that was really transformative happened quite recently, happened last year, when I was able to buy my own property here in London, which, as someone who, I'm 31, there wasn't financial help from my parents in that sense, which is often very much a necessity, trying to buy in the property market in the UK because of the way the economy is structured. But for me, achieving that had always been a serious aspiration throughout my 20s, and I'd saved a lot and maneuvered things so that I was able to do it. And for me, that was about security. Like, it wasn't so much about, I want to buy the place so I can boast about it and so I can show off about it and all that sort of thing, which I think sometimes it can be. For me, it was my understanding of financially the importance of property ownership. The fact, instead of renting and sort of giving my money to a landlord that I'll never see again, the fact that I see this property, this flat of mine, as an investment, and it might be something that ends up seeing me through my retirement, whatever, and it will definitely affect, my quality of life over the years to come. So for me, that was something I was very keenly aware of. I wanted to purchase a property in London in order to have that kind of financial security, to have that equity, I suppose, which makes a really big difference. In the UK, there's such a big split between the haves and the have-nots, the renters and the owners. And, I could talk at length about why that system is, the way it is, and how successive governments have, set up the housing economy to benefit a very privileged few and to penalize everyone else. And that's definitely something that's worth discussing. But I knew that regardless of what the reasons were for this very flawed system, I knew which side of it I wanted to be on. And so that was a real goal of mine. So I think those, for me, are two sort of incidents, I suppose, or events in my life that really transformed how I see money and really transformed my own outlook. Because since buying my flat, since buying my property, I've become far more relaxed and a lot less anxious. I really related to what Rolake was saying about anxiety around money. I used to be extremely, extremely anxious about money. And a lot of that has dissipated because I feel like I now have a stake. I now have this element of financial security, which is something that's very important to me, and I think probably comes from my childhood.
Thank you. Osarate, can you please, in the context of being a tech entrepreneur, talk about a transformative experience in adulthood?
Thanks a lot. I've been an entrepreneur who has failed twice, and both failures taught me a lot of lessons about people and money, how they behave. The first one was a failure because we were broke. We didn't have any more money, so I had to let everybody go. I had to fire 21 people. That was a gut-wrenching experience, for me. And it was something that probably is still the most painful experience I've ever had in my life till today. The second one happened when we had a lot of money. We just closed a deal of $4 million, and those guys just paid us. And the people I was partnering with became greedy. They basically kicked me out and locked me out of the office. So both experiences made me understand how people behave when there is and when there is not. When we didn't have much, people were still loyal till the very, very end. When we had a lot, people were less loyal and more greedy. So both extremes taught me a lot of lessons. And one particular lesson I learned was about trust. Yes, I can trust, but I have to verify that you actually have integrity.
Trust but verify. That is also very good journalistic advice. Obviously, I have to say that as a journalist. So I want to move on to this idea of success and wealth that I would say in every society is relevant, but it slightly differs depending on where you're from. Otega, why don't we start with you? Because you talk about this in We Need to Talk About Money, Is there success without comparison? Is there even a framework to talk about success without ultimately comparing yourself to your peers?
In a nutshell, I think not. I think, the world would be a much better place and we'd all be far happier if it was possible to evaluate your own success in terms of what you actually want and what you set out to achieve. But the world in which we live, and especially in an era of social media where you are able to see, decades ago, the super wealthy existed and we knew of their existence, but we weren't exposed to their lifestyles and to the things that money affords them in the same way we are now. These days, you can open Instagram, you can see, the Kardashians, whoever on their private jet, and not just the super wealthy, but people in your own specific social milieu. So you might see a colleague and they've suddenly bought this really nice house and you think, well, hang on, we do the same job or we work at the same company. How come they can afford that? And I can't afford this, they can afford these super nice holidays. And it's a very natural human instinct to compare yourself to other people. It's one that, I'm guilty of. It's something that, kind of takes a lot of willpower and effort to shed. But essentially, in terms of research and studies that have been done, how happy people are with their level of wealth and their level of success is often very much determined by the people that they are surrounded by, and it's comparative. So, and it's all relative. So there was this really brilliant article that I read in the New York Times a couple of years ago where the journalist spoke to the kind of the 1% of Manhattan. So these are people who are annual incomes are in the millions and above. And the thing that this journalist found as a common thread is that no matter who she spoke to and how much money they had, they felt dissatisfied with their own level of wealth, or they felt they were pinched. And these are people who, as I say, are making millions a year, but they felt pinched because they send their kids to this school and their kids' friends' parents are a billionaire, and they see their kids, schoolmates going on private jet trips to the Caribbean and this sort of thing, and having houses in Aspen, and that completely warps their idea of where their social standing is. And economically, if you actually break down the data, they weren't even in the top 1%. They were in the top 0.1% globally, but they often still felt poor or poorer in comparison to some of their even wealthier contemporaries. And I think that's something that kind of applies to all of us, no matter where on the social spectrum we lie. I think it's just something, I think it's a natural human urge, but I think it's something that just takes a bit of discipline and a bit of willpower and a bit of perspective. I think something that I definitely had a period in my mid-20s of really suffering from what I think of as affluenza, where I was very much kind of watching what everybody else was doing and being like, oh, they've got that, and especially around professional success. And as I'm getting a little bit older, I'm trying very much to reframe what I view as success, so it's not, purely financial, professional, but also in terms of thinking about who I am as a person and what sorts of relationships I have in my life, and what sort of person I am. But these are things that are hard to do because globally and in many societies, certainly within the UK, certainly within, I think, Nigeria and many African countries, we do tend to venerate the rich, and it is seen as a sign of moral virtue. People who are wealthy, it is perceived as a sign of, hard work and ambition and intelligence, when we all know that lots of people get wealthy in lots of different ways. It's not always the case that people work their way into these positions. And so I think it's very natural for people to kind of be striving for more, but it is about kind of taking a bit of a step back and thinking more deeply about what it is that you value as a person, what your values are. And often you'll find that those aren't things that necessarily aligned with just accumulating wealth, essentially.
Rolake, how about yourself? I want to ask the question a little bit differently for you. Is success something that can measure beyond just the material wealth in a way that still brings up comparison towards other people? Is it only in the material, or are there other ways that even beyond the boundaries of accumulating wealth, that we still get stuck in cycles of comparison when we talk about success?
Yes, we often hear that saying that comparison is a thief of joy. And the reality it is, I think philosophically, I think success has to do with the other. And what do I mean by that? I mean, I live and work in Nigeria now. And the reality is, in our society, success is something that others attribute to you. It's not something that you innately, or it is not expected to be something that you innately conceive of yourself. And I think that's where society gets it wrong, because by virtue of being individual human beings with our own independence of thinking, we should define what success means to us. And people measure that by different things. I think there's material success, and unfortunately, everything is so commercialized, even beyond social media. We now have these Forbes 30, and this is not a jibe at Forbes, but we have these lists, the Forbes 30 under 30 wealthiest and the under 20 most successful. And a lot of that yardstick is business or professional success measured by net worth. But if we cast all of that aside, there's a reality, is there's a wealth and the depth of relationships and the fact that we're relational beings. And this is why you see many people, particularly in advanced economies, who win the lottery and end up with suicidal tendencies, or they kill themselves, or they end up bankrupt. Because ultimately it doesn't fill a void, and there's an innate longing in all human beings for a relationship. And we also have to realize that there is something such as the burden of wealth and success. Even in African societies, such as Nigeria, where you're not exorbitantly wealthy, the appearance of wealth or material well-being lends itself to unsolicited requests for money, for financing, for all sorts of things, from family members, from friends. So there's a perception that if you have even just a little, in Nigerian society, at least in the way I grew up, that you are considered wealthy. And so for me, I think we have a fundamental problem around wealth and how we define it. It needs to be more robust. But the reality is, as an individual personally, there are people who I want to model my path to success after. It doesn't mean that I'm comparing myself to them, but they give me a framework for perhaps how to build sustainable wealth, how to be successful. Ultimately, I have to chart my own course. And I think there's nothing wrong in benchmarking against other individuals who have achieved in specific industries or areas that we want to, and even been mentored by them. But I think where we often miss it is, especially amongst younger people in our society, not all of them, but this idea that you can overnight, by the stroke of a pen, become a multi-millionaire and billionaire. And I remember a poem that we learned actually as early as primary school. It's a Yoruba poem. It's quite a long one. It's Ishe ni ogun Ishe, and it's translated literally as work is the antidote to poverty. But one of the things that is clearly apparent, and probably which accounts for why a lot of young people are living, is this idea, because we don't fundamentally live in a meritocratic society, there is a sense in which no matter how hard you work in a country like Nigeria, you can't become wealthy except you have a financial sponsor, a backer, a very rich parent, a godfather, godmother, whatever it is. And so I think in as much as that was meant to instill principles in us, it somehow misses the nuance of being in a society like Nigeria when you say work is the antidote to poverty, because there's so many different factors and drivers on the road between work and wealth or riches. So I think it's a very nuanced conversation. There's so many diverse aspects to it. But for me, success is really how you define it for yourself. Material wealth is important to get by, but it is not everything.
Asarate, as somebody who has failed in entrepreneurship and who has also succeeded, what do you think has been the lesson that you've learned from those two comparisons in terms of how you've come to think about success in comparison to people around you? Because I imagine part of what is really difficult about failing is that other people are succeeding while you're doing it.
There is a very, very different approach to failure now than the way it was maybe like 20 years ago. When I failed the first time, I was happy because I failed the people I was responsible for, not because I failed in comparison to other people. There were not many people who were doing what I was doing at that time. There was no race. It was a choice I made. I could have worked in a bank. My family members own banks. I could have done anything else, but I decided that this was what I was going to do. It was more that I disappointed my family, than comparing myself with other people. Okay. And where I'm from, your family's opinion matters a lot. Okay. And I had to put my tail between my legs to go work for my family again before I tried again a second time. And when it happened the second time, I didn't have to go back. I had to make it work. There's something that there's a point that Rolaka was making that I was just going to speak on. At the end of the day, one of the most destructive things that we inherited from Western culture is this whole culture of individualism. It's me. It's I'm the one responsible for my success. From where I'm from, there's nothing like self-made. It doesn't exist because the community builds you, and this is something I strongly believe in. If you look at most people who are extremely wealthy today, they won't by any chance call themselves self-made. They were built by communities, and they're still supported by communities. If you look at Dangote today, every Dangote depot chief is a billionaire on his own. They are able to become rich and remain sustainably wealthy because there are other people who make money because they make money. And that's real wealth. Concentrating on yourself and thinking that, okay, getting ahead of others is success is so myopic and, self-centered. So most people who think that way don't even know what success means, as far as I'm concerned.
Let's talk a bit more about that individualist approach, which I think tends to dominate how we talk about money and success and wealth. And given the inequality that a lot of Africans on the continent and Black communities in the Western world specifically face, and through the interconnected global financial networks we all operate in, beyond the possibility of, let's say, a large-scale political or economic revolution, what are the current prospects, if any, for a reduction in poverty in terms of community, given the system that we're currently in? Rolake, I'd like you to answer that because of your work. I'd like you to answer that first.
The succeeding together, failing together. I recall that famous saying, I am because you are. The reality is that we're all relational, but in terms of creating mass wealth, or if you like, sustainable wealth from a societal perspective, it really is about systems and people. If you look at sort of ancient societies, even pre-colonial societies, that sense that everybody had to share in the wealth of a village or of a community was very strong. And this idea that everything you own, nothing, you didn't own anything, nothing belonged to you. And I'm even going to take it and look at some institutions and structures in society. Obviously, as someone who grew up in the church and worked in the church, I recall in the early days of growing up in an Anglican home and background, how the church really stepped in and provided schools, provided the hospitals, people donated. There was a lot of philanthropy. There was this sense that you had to pass the wealth and the income around. And I think we've lost a sense of that. But if you look at what's happening in our society today, contemporary Nigerian society and in the economy, there's a sense that the rich are feeding off the poor, who are then becoming poor by virtue of living in a society with the rich. And I think in the conflict we saw over the last 30, 40 years between communist and socialist societies and free market capitalism, there was always that juxtaposition that individuals had to fend for themselves if you're on the capitalist side, and only in social or communist societies did you have this sort of sense of nobody could be more wealthy and we were all equal. And I think we really have to find some balance back to that. There is a sense in which the private sector is doing a lot to change the narrative around building sustainable economic growth and development, where wealth actually trickles down and we create more inclusive societies. And many of the world global discussions now, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, it's all about the SDGs, this idea of inclusivity and diversity, insofar as economic empowerment, which is an outcome of building more wealthy societies, is concerned. But unfortunately, the forces that pull us towards much more individualistic societies are still there. And I don't think we can get away from that. But it is that very force that is driving loads and loads of young people to seek a better life. But ultimately, the idea is they seek a better life because they want to come back and gave back to the communities that created them. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's that continuous tension between an individual's search for wealth and income and the need to be part of a community. And I don't think we can afford to lose that, because that keeps us grounded, and that is more important. So in my work in the private sector, one of the things that we're seeing more of is a lot of companies, corporates thinking more around wealth creation, poverty reduction, more inclusive economies and society. And I would like to think that that's part of a change in orientation around how societies think about building wealth and giving back. But I'm not seeing just as much on the side of the government. I don't think that wealth is trickling down. I also don't see that the current macroeconomic conditions actually help to drive us towards more inclusive societies. In fact, I would say it's actually regressive. I see like we are actually going backwards, and the rich are becoming richer, the poor are becoming poorer. And those who are caught in the middle, which is the majority of people probably on this call, are really just trying to fend for themselves. And everybody's talking about impact and giving back, but we've not been able to build that critical mass. And I really think it's going to take a combination of private sector efforts and governments to make our societies work for the rich and for the poor. But right now, that gulf still exists. And, we continue to do our part to close the gap.
Asante, I want to have your perspective here, especially because you have emphasized being a doe, how much the communal is important, and being Urobo. I very much relate to that as well. And I want to think about, what do you think we need to take that sort of communal approach in a structural kind of way? How do we implement that structurally? Because like it or not, the way pre-colonial societies work, it just doesn't work like that anymore. So how do we take that communal approach from those original societies that we come from and implement it in a structural kind of way?
I had a conversation with somebody just yesterday about what we term the informal economy. And the conclusion we reached was that there's really nothing like an informal economy. What we call the informal economy is actually the economy. It's much larger than we think it is. Because it's not measured doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. If you look at a company like Unpaid that has raised $400 million recently, what they're working on is a space where people did not believe that you could even make money from at all. And I have a personal experience there, two experiences actually. The first one was with the IDP camp in Maiduguri. Somebody came and told us that they needed agents there. And this was a long holiday weekend. So we gave him some POSs. And in one weekend, this guy did 100 million naira in transactions. These are people that we thought were very poor, were refugees. These guys were doing 100 million naira in transactions in one weekend. So there's a lot of abundance that's not captured. There's a lot of economic activity that we ignore because we want to fit into a particular economic construct. The second example was with a company called Maza Health in Ghana, where I was on the board. We're providing emergency services to pregnant women in northern Ghana who were also farmers too as well. When we started it, we wanted them to pay 20 cedis. A lot of them, did not pay. We thought they couldn't pay, which does a very, very big difference. But after the period they were supposed to pay had elapsed, some of them already even had babies, they paid. In fact, almost 100% of them paid. So, which meant all our assumptions about them being poor was wrong. And what we discovered was that they were poor in the way we looked at it, but they were not poor in the way they looked at it. They had their wealth stored as foodstuff. That was what was more important to them. Cash was not important to them. They could lose it. They didn't have banks. They didn't have all of those facilities that we think are important in our own part of the economy. They didn't have those things. So they structured their lives in a way that it works for them. And a majority of people in Africa live that way. If you look at the Igbo apprenticeship scheme called the Mwahia, that is what all our retail trade, is based on. Other tribes have similar constructs too as well. What we think is informal, what we think is poverty, is not really what we think it is. Let me put it that way. Thank you.
Otega, In your book, when you talk about money, I want to take this question a little bit differently for you, because one thing I really loved is the focus on gender. So when we talk about the communal perspective of how do we approach changes in terms of a structural approach, whether in the public or private sectors, what are we missing in terms of the gender aspect of this?
Well, I think the key thing we're missing is the amount of, I guess, labor or unpaid labor that women in all societies all over the world contribute to the economy. When I say unpaid labor, I mean this is kind of domestic labor work that's done at home. This is looking after children, cleaning, domestic work. And there are so many women in the world who are not able to, who are either doing that on top of the work they contribute to kind of the formal recognized economy, or who are not able to fully contribute or to fully participate in the formal economy because of their domestic duties, essentially. And especially during the pandemic, this all worsened. So in times of crisis, in times of economic crisis, the, I guess, unequal burden of household labor tends to become more acute, and it tends to fall more heavily on women. So we saw that, in 2008, in light of the post-financial recession, and we saw it again with the COVID pandemic, which is that a lot of women, I'm talking about data that's kind of pertaining to the UK, but I think it's fairly safe to assume that this applies to many more economies. A lot of women, left the workplace, essentially. And this is because the key thing is often around childcare and the lack of affordable or free childcare. So in the UK, childcare is very expensive. It's hard to access, and a lot of women found that they couldn't balance their home care responsibilities. And when the schools were closed, their children at home, they were having to homeschool. Often it was women who were taking time off work or leaving their jobs in order to look after the children, because the male partners in the relationships were the higher earners because of all the kind of structural and systemic factors that relates in. So it often made sense for women to be the ones to stay at home. If you're thinking about how you can maintain your household income, well, the person who is earning less money is going to be the one to stay at home, and that often tends to be women. So a lot of progress that feminism has made in the past several decades was reversed almost overnight by the pandemic. And this is where governments need to step in and ensure that childcare and maternity rights and paternity rights do allow women to participate in the economy in an equal way. Because at the moment there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of rhetoric, certainly from the British government. We had the whole thing here about kind of clap for carers and clap for NHS carers, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer was saying, oh, well done to all the mums who've been picking up the slack. And actually I thought to myself, well, what if they didn't have to? What if when all these schools were closed, what if there had been childcare facilities and creches and places so that people could go and put their children, in the nicest possible way, and continue to work if that's what they so choose. At the moment, it is the case that once a woman has children, her marriage and sort of having children tends to be beneficial for men's salaries, but it tends to be detrimental for women's salaries. And over the course of a lifetime, they lose out on hundreds of thousands of pounds, and their salaries never really recover. And a huge part of that is because of the inaccessibility of childcare. So that is something that certainly within the UK, I don't have the exact specifics on every other economy, but certainly within the UK, and I imagine with a lot of other developed economies, that is something that needs to be urgently addressed in terms of how we can, in terms of spreading the wealth, allowing women to fully participate in the workplace, and allowing them to earn the same as men do. The lack of childcare, and I don't want to say burden of motherhood, but the economic burden of motherhood and how it impacts women's livelihoods is one of the core reasons for existing gender pay gaps all around the world.
I want to ask an open-ended question, and it's really important to get this one out there, but I'm not going to direct it to anybody in particular. So whoever feels so inclined, please jump in. The image of wealthy Africans, and specifically wealthy Nigerians, has become part of the narrative of the diasporan African, to the point of, I would say, caricature. And this stands in stark contrast to Nigeria having one of the highest rates of poverty in the world. What do these two divergent images confess about Nigerian society, Nigerian political arrangements, and Nigerian people as a whole?
I'm gonna jump in there and say something, because I'm really glad that you've brought up this contrast, because this is something that bothers me. And like you say, sometimes it can kind of be a little bit of a joke. Nigerians, we like to show off, we like to do yanga, all of that kind of thing. I personally find it incredibly gross that in a country that actually has as much wealth as Nigeria does have, it's concentrated in the hands of such a small minority. And as you say, it has one of the highest rates of poverty. There are a lot of people who are suffering and poor, can't make ends meet in Nigeria, but then often what we're concerned about, and I say we in the kind of broader sense of all Nigerians, is kind of projecting this image of Nigerian wealth. And I think maybe part of that is a way of countering, certainly the West, what some, preconceptions of Nigerians are. I think, there's this narrative amongst kind of diasporan Nigerians of this is the side of Nigeria they don't show you, this is the Africa they don't show you. And it's like we're trying to prove something to someone. Who are you trying to prove something to? It's like, oh, it's not all kids in mud huts or whatever. We also have luxury. We also have, high-end place, high-end boutiques. And I think to myself, who are you trying to prove something to? For whose benefit is this? Because real Nigerians who live there, Nigerians who are part of the country, we know, there is a gulf in terms of the different lifestyles that Nigerians live. So if you're obsessed with kind of projecting this to other people, and especially to the West, that Nigeria too has wealth, Nigeria too has wealthy people, I kind of have to question, what are you doing that for? But I think more generally, again, because this is something that really, really jars me, and kind of when I kind of look at my contemporaries and see some of the values that pushed forward, it's very individualistic. So talking about investment back into Africa, back into Nigeria, it is still concentrated amongst themselves and amongst their own social groups, which is essentially middle class, upper middle class. It's not about, philanthropy, really. I don't see a huge emphasis on that. And it's not about, really sustained long-term investment into infrastructure. It's not political, it's not about lobbying. It's not about, and these are, wealth equals power. So there is political power associated with that. But I think there's also a fear of rocking the boat politically, because then who knows what might happen to you. So I definitely have a lot of thoughts, but in general, that contrast and that binary is, for me, one of the things that I struggle most with about being a diasporan Nigerian.
Can I perhaps bring some balance to that? As somebody who spent 19 years in the UK and then moved back to Nigeria 6 years ago, I think part of the challenge was I moved back to Nigeria a few years after the whole African rising craze. People sort of the rejoinder to Economist articles about the dark continent. And I got the sense that initial momentum was because people had just got so upset and irritated at the portrayal of images of Africa as being this poverty-stricken mosquitoes and flies and starvation in Ethiopia and whatnot. And I recall Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, one of the very first TED Talks she gave, she talked about the danger of a single story. And so for me, it was really about Nigerians trying to balance the narrative, which unfortunately then went to the other extreme, because the reality is the showcase of luxury and wealth is really just 0.000% of the entire population, most of whom live in poverty, and that's the reality. And so I've taken a much more balanced approach to that. And the reality is most of us who are on these platforms, on the social media and Instagram, talking about these things do not represent the majority of Nigerians. That's the reality. Insofar as I'm now part of the home crowd, I live and work home and I'm trying to make a difference, I realize that even me, I'm still a minority. And I also recall that, the backlash when the BBC showed the Welcome to Lagos documentary years ago. I was just happy that Lagos was being talked about, never mind what people felt about the images that were being portrayed. So I think we need to have a real conversation about these things. I do think that there is a danger of a single narrative around the reality of African life. Yes, we have the poverty, but there are a lot of people on the ground who are trying to make a difference. And I don't think it's all diasporans who look at it through this rose-tinted glasses. I think there are a lot of people who are genuinely trying to bring change. What we do lack is a critical mass and the sustainability of that change movement. But I see glimpses of hope, and I think I'm cautiously optimistic that we can continue to etch away at the negative narratives and actually bring long-lasting sustainable development to our societies.
So we know that Africans are an enterprising people, whether at home or away, and yet we see policies across the continent that are arguably set up to disfavor the pursuit of entrepreneurship. And so, in your opinion, how do governments make better use of the fact that there are enterprising young people, there's a young population, so as not to waste the brain power and the potential of, I would say, Africans as a whole across the continent?
We have a very, very huge disconnect between generations. We had people who took over at the time African countries were gaining independence when they were very, very young, who largely are still in power and who control a lot of the wealth and the resources up to today. They don't see that kind of future. And it's really, really sad because a lot of the young people don't have resources and they are powerless, so to speak. So I don't think things are going to change all of a sudden. I don't think that whatever we say or do is going to change these people because they are who they are. What we need to do is organize from the bottom to be able to see that we can actually enforce these changes, gradually by ourselves. So it won't happen from the top. It has to happen from the bottom. That's all I have to say in a nutshell.
Rolake, do you have anything to add?
No, look, job creation is important. And I think you should say the reality is many things have to go into that pot of solution. So I don't think you should be worried about that. You're onto something. I think part of the problem is there are no jobs, right?
Exactly.
But in order to create jobs, you have to build the kind of economy where those jobs are available. And you have to have the type of education that prepares young people for the workplace. If you look at our educational institutions, our tertiary institutions, I mean, I interview graduates who can use basic Microsoft Word, and they come out with degrees in technology or science. And so I'm saying, where is the relevance? And I think that whole concept of economic planning, actually matching how you structure your education to the needs of your economy, is something that the government is missing. And that is why there are no jobs. And then we have to realize that the world is a small place. Essentially, the world is, talent is global. So we're competing even for homegrown talent with the rest of the world. And that is our reality. So I think policy definitely has to focus on education, as Osarity has said, and by extension, job creation. But also, I'm seeing the government becoming a lot more interventionist in structures and institutions and sectors where young people are building businesses. So why this interventionist approach to fintech, to cryptocurrency? SMEs are bleeding. And I'm saying that these are the things young people are creating disintermediated platforms and economies for themselves as a result of the failure of the government to provide services where it should be providing services. So rather than make it more difficult for a young person to set up a startup, why not enable them with the right skills and the incentives they need to do so? And so for me, those are some of the things that we need to face up to the reality. And we have to remember that political freedom and the ability to voice freedom of expression is absolutely key to economic prosperity. They're not mutually exclusive. The two go hand in hand. And insofar as we're trying to push prosperous economies and inclusive economies for young people, political freedom is just as important. I thought I would throw that one in there.
Osarity, do you want to have the final word and include what you didn't include in your last answer?
Nigeria is a place that has a lot of abundance in terms of resources, in terms of people. But there's also abundant injustice. There's also abundant suffering. Sometimes we mistake that injustice and the suffering for poverty. Most people want to project themselves above all of that. They want to aspire to be better than what the circumstances have forced them to endure. There are people I know, in fact, I'll give you an instance. There's somebody I know in Benin who had 300 million naira invested in the stock market. But he was still living his life. He wasn't living flamboyantly. He wasn't living like all of those people that you see in the Nollywood movies and all of that. If you look at the statistics of the highest amount of equity investments that come from regions in Nigeria, most of it comes from Anambra State, where you have the traders, where you have all of those people who do not flaunt wealth, who do not behave in the way that we now think wealth is supposed to be. So actual wealth and actual prosperity is very, very different from what is being portrayed outside. And as Rolake mentioned, it's also a response to the caricature that we had of Africa in the past, of this whole dark continent. And we now move to the extreme to show that, look, things are not as bad as we think it is. But the reality is there's a lot of abundance, but there's also abundant injustice and abundant suffering. So thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the panel on wealth and success. We really appreciate your time. We hope this has been informative. It certainly has for me. Thank you to all the guests for joining us as well. Cheers.
That 5 minutes madness only you can understand. Visit myspectre.com to get your Spectre experience. Spectre, loans in 5 minutes.